faced, a province at war. Because Britain was denied access to the treaty ports, Londonderry, her most westerly harbour, became the vital strategic outpost in the Battle of the Atlantic. 140 British and American warships lay at anchor in the Foyle, and the city became home to almost 20,000 servicemen. It was the only time in Derry's history when unemployment was unknown. Here, in Churchill's famous phrase, Ulster stood, a faithful sentinel.
Ulster's great shipping industry, cradle of men of war and great liners, is busier than ever. 100% in
But
the war,
it wasn't just
Northern
warships
Ireland
that rolled down the slipways of Harland and Wolff. Tanks for North Africa rumbled through its gates. Industrial Belfast made a vital contribution to the war. Shorts turned out heavy Sterlings that became the mainstay of Bomber Command.
They refused to be governed by Dublin.
But Ulster's war effort wasn't quite what the newsreels proclaimed. British ministers complained about strikes and low output. Even the King, visiting his forces in the north, spoke sharply to Ulster's Prime Minister about the lack of cooperation from the Stormont government. But for the province's fighting men, His Majesty had nothing but praise. To them, and thousands of Ulstermen who fought for Britain in World War II, political intrigue and secret deals didn't figure on the radar. They only wanted to serve their country. Men like Spitfire pilot Bill Polly were volunteers to a man. There was no conscription in Northern Ireland. A heady mixture of patriotism and high adventure summoned young Ulster to join combat on land, sea and air.
It was one of the jobs we had in 501 Squadron. We went across to Dieppe, Beloy and these places early morning and usually later in the evening. And the idea was to investigate whether any boats had arrived or E-boats present which could affect our shipping, photograph them. The camera was on the side of the Spitfire, and the idea was you went across a section of two and one stayed aloft watching for enemy aircraft, and you took a deep breath and you dived from about maybe 4,000 feet and did a half circuit of the port at about 1,000 feet. Of course, they knew you were coming, they knew what you were doing, so they fired everything at you. They allowed us to do occasional fighter sweeps, which was the thing we preferred most, and you just flew low over the country, and your object was to hit anything that moved. Really, if you saw army trucks, you knew they were German trucks, and you fired at them. You only had one chance, a quick burst, and straight on, because you're at low level, and you lost them behind you almost immediately. We were travelling over a countryside that was fairly wooded, and I banked slightly right, and found myself more or less facing a road, and there were soldiers marching down it, obviously German soldiers, probably about platoon strength. And without even thinking about it, I just left my wing, pressed the tip of the thing, and I could see the strikes, you know, the cannon shells going into the group and exploding in the road among them. So that I often thought it was a chance encounter that probably caused quite a lot of deaths or damage. And you wonder afterwards, you know, you do think of these things afterwards, was it necessary? Did it help the war effort?
Beneath the cloudless skies through which weekend pilots still roam lie relics of ancient airfields. Devotees like Ernie Crummy of the Ulster Aviation Society lovingly collect logs and records of those once heroic times.
The planning, design, siting and functions of all those airfields were determined by a number of factors. The first one of which was the need for airfields to accommodate coastal command squadrons to protect shipping going to and from the United Kingdom. 5 airfields were created for that purpose. They were at Limavady, Castle Archdale, Nuts Corner, Ballykelly and Aldergrove. And it's a mark of the strategic importance of those 5 airfields that aircraft operating from them were officially credited with sinking at least 30 U-boats, which represents about 16 or 17% of U-boats sunk by aircraft action in all the theatres of war. So that was the first factor. The second factor was the need to provide airfields to accommodate fighter squadrons to defend the population, industrial and military target areas. And 5 airfields were created for that purpose. And then there was a peculiarly Irish factor which greatly preoccupied the minds of the Air Ministry planners in the initial stages of the war. And this was the fear that the Germans might decide to attack through Eire. Now, large numbers of British soldiers were based in Northern Ireland against that eventuality. And in the event of an invasion, they would have counterattacked across the border with air support. So 3 airfields were created to accommodate those units. In Northern Ireland, there has been a long tradition of military flying. It goes back, in fact, to the establishment in 1925 of the first of a number of special reserve squadrons in the Royal Air Force. 5 in total were created, the very first one of which was 502 Ulster Special Reserve Squadron.
We were embodied, called up really, on the 24th of August 1939, about 12 days before the war started. And we hung about Aldergrove until the fatal day, Sunday the 2nd. And then we started operations virtually immediately with anti-submarine patrols around the Irish Sea, Clyde area with our Anson aircraft.
Ulster pilots also ranged far out into the North Atlantic. Terry Bullock from Lurgan sent more U-boats to their grave than any other British flyer. Much of his success was due to his unconventional technique.
Our initial instructions were that we should, as soon as we sighted one, we'd shove the nose down and just go hell for leather at it, regardless of the angle to its track on the water. Try and attack it before it submerged, because they could submerge in 60 seconds if they saw you. And I changed the plan of attack. We used to stalk them and try and attack them at an angle of 20 degrees to its line of track. We only had 6 depth charges to drop on it. Would cover the whole length of the U-boat. It got a much better chance of doing some lethal damage that way than attacking straight across at right angles, where only 1 or possibly 2 might be effective.
Bullock won a bar to his DSO in an epic battle.
It was a long way out in the Atlantic. It was down in the gap southwest of Greenland. We were up in Iceland actually at the time on detachment from Nuts Corner. And I think we'd flown out 6 hours to find this convoy. This was the day actually, I think it was the HX-217. They had 20 U-boats in the vicinity of this convoy. And we took up position, and as I went round the back of it, we spotted this U-boat on the surface, which was trailing the convoy at about 10 or 11 miles behind it. After sinking that one, carried on with our patrol, and in the next 4 hours we found another 6. But we only had our cannons and machine guns. But we forced them under. The main thing in those days, if you make a submarine submerge, you'll have to slow down, and if the convoy changes course, the odds are that they won't pick up the convoy again, submarines. And they didn't lose any ships that day at all.
This was the Focke-Wulf Condor, a long-range 4-engine aircraft. It greatly harassed shipping and convoys, both in terms of actually bombing the convoys and also working in conjunction with U-boats, by directing U-boats towards convoys in order that they also could attack the ships. The threat of this was countered quite effectively in the early stages of the war, when a number of coastal command squadrons were based at Aldergrove, operating aircraft such as Hudsons and Blenheims, and indeed on 2 occasions aircraft from Aldergrove managed to shoot down 2 Focke-Wulf Condors.
But it was the amphibious Catalina that made one of Ulster's greatest contributions to the Battle of the Atlantic. Loch Earn was the watery runway from which they patrolled the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic. Canadian Bill Parker was air gunner on a Loch Earn Catalina.
When they came in first, the first aircraft came here with a boatload of RAF. They came over to see if a flying boat base on Loch Earn was feasible. And the report they took back was no way, no good. Well, we would have had to fly from here, go way up around by Londonderry, and then across the north coast to get out. But it was only a few months after they said it wasn't any good that they started building. But they made a deal, Churchill made a deal with De Valera in Eire for a 40-mile corridor out the Shannon, out on the Shannon River. Well, that meant that would cut about 2 hours off it, give us at least 150 miles start that we would have had to fly before we were anywhere near the ocean, you see.
Another Catalina pilot who flew guard over the Atlantic convoys was Ben Barnes from County Antrim.
Their instructions were to fly diagonally across it, roughly at an angle of 30 degrees, across what you thought was the sub's course. And you'd then press the button, and if, or at least your bomb aimer did, we were using a low-level bomb sight at the time, and the result was that ideally the first 2 or 3 depth charges should have fallen on this side of the submarine and the rest on the far side. In other words, you should have straddled the submarine. And they guaranteed us that if you did straddle the submarine, one of your depth charges would be within lethal range. We discovered afterwards, of course, that this wasn't strictly true. The depth charges weren't that powerful.
From a strategic point of view, Loch Earn may have been the perfect seaplane base, but its myriad islands made takeoff and landing a nightmare from the pilot's point of view.
Well, we came in one night, and it was just where the Catalina landed. We were coming in heading right for that island, and then we got to know where the boats were. Well, the wind coming up the lake there caught our tail, and it swung us. That we seen the second flare. We could only see one flare at that time, but then we seen the second flare swung around on the flare path and landed. And we were coming in on a Walton, the powerboat, brought us in from the aircraft, and a Catalina came in the same way. But he didn't turn taut, he went straight into that island, just hit there and blew up. They were all killed in that.
The Catalina's greatest triumph was locating the pride of the German fleet, the Bismarck. Flying out of Loch Earn, she spotted her prize, which led to one of the greatest naval engagements of the war.
Then the chase of the Bismarck across the Atlantic Ocean, in which the CNC's flagship King George V and HMS Rodney finally accounted for the stricken raider. She had been observed by a flying boat of Coastal Command and torpedoed by aircraft from Ark Royal and Victorious in a hunt which will echo down the corridors of time.
On average, 1,000 Ulstermen a month volunteered to don uniform and fight for Britain.
I experienced, you see, the air attack in Belfast in '41. I was still at home. And when I saw the mess that made of things, I certainly wanted to get into action to try and put a stop to this in a small way, you know.
Everybody was intensely loyal. The Germans and the Italians were the bad guys. We were the good guys. There was no question about it.
Many were little more than schoolboys when they joined, enlisting from cadet units.